Why does the Bible seemingly support slavery? Should Catholics be pro-slavery? If not, what are actual historical and theological reasons not to? Has the church always been morally against slavery?
Okay, well, firstly, you've got to bear in mind that slavery was part of the world in which the church came to exist, as is reflected in the Bible. Our Lord certainly did not abolish slavery. St. Paul declared that slaves should obey their masters and masters should be kind to their slaves. Interestingly enough, the two classes of people amongst whom Catholicism first became popular in Rome were the diametric opposites: the old pre-imperial nobility and the slaves.
Mm.
The old nobility, because the faith gave a supernatural justification for their centuries-long attempt to hold on to traditional Roman virtues. And the slaves, because it gave meaning and value to their lives. And because of that, up to and including the 19th century, the church inevitably worked hard at ameliorating the worst elements of slavery. It encouraged slave owners to free their slaves, but it never directly condemned the institution. It condemned a lot of abuses that came out of it. It laid down regulations forbidding various things that made it harder and harder, shall we say, for a slave owner to do whatever he wanted with his property. And eventually, as time went on, slavery died out in Western Europe. It would not be revived again until the 1400s, when a very funny, strange, peculiar thing happened. The west coast of Africa had been a great market for slaves. The little kingdoms there in West Africa in those days were divided up into a lot of little tiny kingdoms, whose rulers would fight one another for the specific purpose of taking prisoners. And those prisoners would be sold as slaves. To whom, you ask? Well, they would be sold to the great Arab cities in North Africa. And there were long caravan routes that took black slaves from West Africa across the Sahara to the thriving markets waiting for them. But in the 1400s, a funny thing happened. A tribe called the Tuaregs rebelled against whoever had been ruling them and cut the caravan lines between northern Africa and the west coast. So now the kings of the west coast were completely without any market for their wares, and they got kind of plugged up with excess merchandise.
Mm.
But then the gods of commerce smiled upon them, and the white sails of the Europeans appeared. And much to the joy of the little kings of West Africa, a new market appeared. Why did it appear? Well, because first the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, and the Dutch, and the English, and the French were busy settling the West Indies and what became the American South and the Caribbean coast of North America. The Indians did not work very well as involuntary labor, and the slaves were conceived of initially as a way to relieve the strain on the Indians.
Mm.
Also, initially, it wasn't just black slaves who were brought over. Under Cromwell, a lot of Irish and Scots slaves were brought. There were a lot of those people because of the wars of the Three Kingdoms. Anyway, long story short, slavery in Protestant versus slavery in Catholic countries became very, very different. In that, in Catholic countries, i.e. France, Spain, and Portugal, there were laws on the books to govern slavery. And certainly with the French, there were a lot of restrictions on what a slave owner could do. Most notably, he had to teach his slaves the Catholic religion. And if he fathered a child on a slave girl, he had to recognize and educate the child as his own. Why was this important? Well, the reason is that in the English colonies, later to become the United States, he could get a better price for slaves with white blood. And what that meant was that by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of the slaves looked like white people. But what it led to with the French and the Spanish was the rise of a class of free people of color. And these folks, certainly with the French, often had French educations, as in France, and owned plantations and slaves of their own. But from the time that Louisiana came under American control, their position was continually eroded. And then came the Civil War, which kind of destroyed it entirely. And it was only in the 20th century that they began to gain political power in Louisiana. And now, interestingly enough, their descendants have a lot of it again. But that, and of course, the free people of color are, to this day, specifically from Louisiana and to a degree from Maryland, are the backbone of the the Catholic Church amongst blacks in America. Now then, so late as 1867, what was the Holy Office, now the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was asked to rule on slavery 2 years after the defeat of the Confederacy, rather, in our Civil War, but 20 years and more before the abolition of slavery in Brazil. They were asked if slavery was an inherent evil, and the response was, it was not in and of itself an inherent evil, but it gave rise to lots and lots and lots of other evils that had to be dealt with in their own specific term. The most obvious, of course, is that when someone has the right of life and death over another human being, the temptation to abuse that right in so many ways is huge. And even though the law in Catholic countries forbade all sorts of things to a slave owner, there were certainly those who took advantage. Having said all of that, and having pointed out the difference between slavery in the English-speaking states and slavery elsewhere, one also has to point out something else, and that is that slave revolts in slaveholding countries were always a great danger. There was the big one in Haiti in 1792, and there was the famous Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, where rebelling slaves slaughtered, literally, 67 people, including women and children. The leader of that revolt, Nat Turner, is about to get a statue for himself in Richmond. But having said all of that, by the time of the American Civil War, when the majority of the white Southern population, certainly the slave-owning population, marched off to fight the Yankees, guess who was left behind to look after their plantations and their families?
Who?
The slaves. How many slave revolts were there during the Civil War?
Probably none.
Correct. Now, I'm not going to presume to explain that little factoid. It's just a matter of record. Does that by itself mean that slavery was a good thing? No. But it does mean that, like any other human institution, which in and of itself is good or bad, on the actual level where human people lived, human beings worked with it, dealt with it. And some of them were Simon Legree, some of them were Mrs. O'Hara, and probably most of them were in between.
I've been working on a book that I came across in your bibliography. We have it at our house. The Framework of a Christian State. This is, I think, written in 1920, but I've been working on it, and it had an interesting. It talks about some of these tough issues here with slavery and usury, and it's written by Father Cahill, who was a Jesuit at the time, but I guess that's before the Jesuits
Got cray cray.
clearly, yeah, before they went cray cray. But he says the slave question was the most troublesome and thorny issue of all the difficulties that the church had to deal with.
Sure.
And then this is due to the notion of social upheaval, unfortunately, because it was so entrenched that he said, hence the church had to proceed slowly and cautiously.
See, the question again is with revolution.
Yeah.
What will bring about the greater good?
Right. But he does say he shows how the church did absolutely always favor the abolition. He says the liberation of slaves was endowed with special ecclesiastical favor.
Yes.
It was usual to perform the ceremony of manumission in the church, and the bishop was accorded by civil law special powers to facilitate it. The church also took liberated slaves under her special protection and strictly forbade that they should be in any way again reduced to servitude. Under the influence of the church, the state also made other enactments to facilitate the manumission of slaves. The movement was further supported by the example of Christian masters who frequently set free their whole household of slaves. Besides all this, the general attitude of the Christians toward their slaves and towards the poor set an example which profoundly affected the whole tone of Roman society. They're looking at Roman society. Now, here's an interesting hypothesis I'd like your opinion on. Because Father Cahill says, if the Roman state had been allowed to develop on the new lines thus marked out, the 6th century A.D. would probably have seen the complete liberation of the slaves and the establishment of a fully developed Christian social regime. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I would. But you had other things in play, like the barbarian invasions.
Right. I think he talks about that, which there are some impediments there in history. Yeah.
And also, there's something else to be borne in mind, and that is when we look at slavery, we tend to look at it entirely, again, through the prism of American eyes. Now, there certainly is no doubt that the church favored abolition, but they always favored it in a gradual manner, with as undue a disruption of life as possible. I mean, if you compare how slavery ended in the West Indies with the way it was ended in the United States, it's hugely different.
Yeah,
because the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Danes did so gradually. They did so in such a way to try to keep the slaves from being sort of thrown on the job market with no skills and nothing, to keep the planters from going bankrupt.
Yeah.
Any one of which would have really ruined the economy of the islands. They had to be very careful with the way it was done. And mind you, the way they did it was far from perfect, but it was head and shoulders over the Reconstruction becomes Jim Crow way we did it.
Yeah. So long story short, abolition is absolutely the ideal. It's great. Just don't do it in such a way that it absolutely destroys society, right?
No. And that it makes the lives of the slaves worse than they were as slaves.
That too. Yeah, they're looking out. Yeah, there you go.
See, you see it as the revolution, as the church's teaching on just revolt or just war. Don't do anything that will make it worse. I know this is a hard idea for us to wrap our heads around, because the way we do things today is we smash things up and hope for the best, and then don't understand why there are bad consequences. Well, okay. As my late father used to say, when you're stupid, bad things happen. That's true. They do. So, whenever you're going to do something with vast repercussions, overthrow a government, go to war against somebody, completely alter a centuries-old institution that is part of the warp and woof of your society, do so carefully. Don't do it if you're going to make things worse. And if you are going to do it,
Yeah.
try to lessen the pain as much as possible. I know, hard idea, because we want it now, and we don't care if it's never worked. We want it our way, and we want it this moment. Well, you can do that. Downside is that nature will always say, and punish you in bad ways. People will react in ways you weren't expecting. Badness can happen, even sometimes to you. But it wasn't supposed to happen that way.